welcome to Deval Sanghavi. He's this Texas-born investment banker who moved to Mumbai, gave everything up, started Dasra at a time when philanthropy really wasn't such a big thing in India. I'm still not sure it is, but he's done a considerable amount to create a culture of giving in a society where it is perhaps restricted to certain areas. He's launched the Dasra Philanthropy Forum, the Dasra Giving Week, the Dasra Giving Circle, the Dasra Changemakers program, a whole lot of things. And it's not just a question of giving money. He's directed something like $72 million, if I'm not mistaken, to the Indian social sector over the past few years, but also a question of devoting energy and expertise and time, which really is something that Dasra does very well. It creates partnerships with non-profits, with governments, with corporates, and it shares its expertise, which is really something quite remarkable. So I'm really privileged to introduce Deval of the COVID beard. Uh, and thank you so much for coming on. And Deval, let me start with asking you right away, how big is the mental health crisis in India currently, and especially after COVID, during COVID?
It is significant. As you said, I think, all of us are going through various stages of lockdown, given where we are, given our status, given the ability to work from home and on a computer like we are fortunate to do, but there's so many others in our country that don't have that same luxury. And so I think just the amount of stress that we're all going through, honestly, is far more significant than what we've seen in the past. And therefore the need to start having some of these conversations, the need for outreach, the need for support in these trying times, I would say, are far greater today and will continue to be so for the next few years than perhaps ever before.
Deval, in the list of priorities, mental health, unfortunately, is still pretty much at the bottom. I mean, there's so many other issues that attract funding and time and care. There's women empowerment, child welfare, sanitation, access to clean water. Where does mental health fit into this?
According to the Mental Health Matters report, which the Mariwala Health Initiative put together, in their research, they showed 10 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that all countries, including India, has signed up for, actually have or impacted by mental health.
Okay.
And so I think what COVID has also taught us, hopefully, is that one cannot look at these sectors or subsectors in silos.
Right.
And so without proper mental health, if we're not feeling good about ourselves, if we don't have confidence, if we don't have agency, chances are we will not want to invest in ourselves. So education, livelihoods, environment, I mean, multiple aspects of what we do on a regular basis actually does get it affected if we are not feeling well. And again, we all know that as a society, if you have a fever, you're not expected to go to work. But when it comes to mental health, we sort of brush it under the carpet. We think that it doesn't exist, but so I think the linkages of mental health to what you're saying is integrated in perhaps majority of the development sector goals that the world has looked to solve.
Right.
And it may be one of those underlying areas as well that we all need to focus on. And so I think that's at least what we're seeing, is that if you don't sort of address, again, one's belief in themselves and their desire to make themselves or see themselves as being impactful and useful in society, chances are a lot of the other programs that the government is, for example, implementing will not necessarily succeed. And so we, at least in Dasra, see it as one of those root cause issues that need focus, regardless of your end goal in sanitation, livelihoods, or housing.
What are the issues in the mental health space? It's awareness, de-stigmatization, capacity building, access to critical care. How do you place these issues?
And so I guess what we've seen, at least in our own work as Dasra, and we launched a very short but sort of high level synopsis a few years ago in a report called Minding the Gap. And what's great about this sector currently is that you do have players, nonprofits that are focusing on different stages of this continuum.
Right.
And so I think that number one, just understanding that different initiatives and organizations exist in each of the areas that you just mentioned,
Right.
I think is important because unfortunately, again, it is a continuum, and very few organizations, even in the for-profit world, can handle any continuum
Right.
fully on their own. And so I think highlighting what are those initiatives, who are the players, what is the good work that they're doing, will hopefully enable individuals, philanthropists, corporates, foundations to start playing a role in supporting some of these initiatives. So I think that's number one. I think in looking at that continuum, again, we're so far back in terms of the nascency of this sector in India that I don't think we have the privilege per se to say, let's focus on one versus the other.
Right.
And so I think that's really where donors and their appetite for risk, as well as where they feel more passionate about, I think, can play a role in sort of funding, a particular area or the ecosystem overall. But there's definitely a lot of opportunity, again, for funding to come in and for impact to be had.
So what role can philanthropy play in that sense?
Unfortunately, not as much as it needs to be.
Right.
And so we do have some foundations that have been focusing on this in the Indian space. And so, as I had mentioned earlier, the Mariwala Health Initiative supports different groups in this particular space. Dorabji Tata Trust has been funding organizations in this space, Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiatives, Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies. And so we do have a handful that have been focusing on mental health. But again, the need is so great. The same amount of funds, for example, that you will be seeing hopefully coming in for COVID doesn't necessarily at all compare for mental health. And so when you look at maternal health or adolescent health or prenatal health, these are areas that I think are just better defined. There's greater policies in place, there's greater funders in place. And there's a realization, again, of building sort of public health infrastructure, both in rural and urban markets, but then overlaying sort of mental health within those institutions. Unfortunately, I think we still have a ways to go. And I think where private philanthropy in particular can play a role is in helping, again, with perhaps some of these leapfrogging initiatives in hotlines or utilizing the internet most effectively, where I'm sure there are ways, for example, just to even look at keywords that individuals search on Google, especially the youth who are more active on social media, to sort of pick up, are there these issues? Is there any way that we can then see if we can, provide some level of awareness to groups that are more prone to certain search words, or even in their social media accounts that say or display images that perhaps could be linkages, for the need of therapy and support.
What about CSR? Does that cover mental health?
So CSR does cover health. And again, as we talked about earlier, mental health is a key component of health. CSR also covers education and livelihoods. And again, mental health is a key component of that. And that's where, at least from a Dasra angle, we feel having a more integrated approach to your funding is important. Because again, if you're having, for example, in these times, if you're funding an education program where 60, 70, 80% of the students are under anxiety and stress, if you're not funding your NGO partners dealing with education to focus on that stress and having special programs to have those conversations like you earlier suggested, chances are these kids are not going to use the
Right.
education or absorb it in a manner without sort of dealing with these underlying causes. And so I think integrating it again across the board is really, really important. And that's again what COVID has taught us. You know, as we've seen, for example, the 100 to 200 million migrants and their families suffering, unfortunately, I would say the development sector, especially CSR, has taken a very siloed view in their funding.
Right.
And so they say, I will only fund this element of it. And I think, again, what we've realized with COVID is everything is interrelated. And especially, you know, if 10 out of the 17 sustainable development goals have mental health as a strong bearing to them, including it in your sort of programs are going to be important.
Do you need a different approach to investment in mental health than from other areas?
I think, and again, I would say this is a different approach that's perhaps needed for the entire sector in development is and needs to be much more around holistic solutions.
Right.
And focusing on certain areas that may not be as tangible. And so again, when you're looking at mental health and comparing it to other initiatives in the health space, you know, the the diagnostics that exist and most other health-related issues, diseases, whether it's cardiovascular or diabetes, you know, there is a set sort of view that once you get this diagnosis, you get this treatment. And I think we all need to realize that with mental health, both the diagnosis takes a little longer and the treatment for many of these illnesses is not actually driven by drugs and medication.
Yeah.
It's driven by counseling and support groups. And so I think that shift therefore has to be made, and figuring out, I guess, a new solution in the Indian context, given that we don't have the number of psychiatrists that our country needs, really investing in more community-based models, I think is going to be critical for this to really scale and create the impact that's required versus trained medical practitioners, which we just won't be there anytime soon in this and perhaps even the next generation.
So if I were to ask you for a roadmap for investment in this sector, how would you contour it?
And so again, I think, and you mentioned sort of 5 or 6 areas at the beginning when we look at the continuum. And so definitely one is sort of on the awareness side of things, then the de-stigma side of things, and the actual treatment. And again, it could be through counseling, it could be through, you know, technology, it could be through hotlines, at least as the first port of call. Then I think there's actual medical practitioners, which again will be required. And no, am I saying community health workers can do it all?
Right.
And then finally, there's, you know, the support mechanisms that one needs for families to go through this. And so I think if we start looking at each of these areas, there are definitely gaps across the board in each of them. And then it's really up to an individual foundation, NGO head, or funder to really think about where they would like to play. Clearly, there are interlinkages in each of these areas, and it's a continuum, not a siloed approach. But I think as a philanthropist, I think thinking about this roadmap, getting a better understanding of who are those players, and also understanding where they would like to participate in, since each of these solutions are quite different in nature. In interventions, and then really taking a longer term view, you know, a 7 to 10 year view, I think is going to be critical. Mental health, again, is an issue that not just affects Indians, it is a global issue, and it is an issue globally that has been underfunded and just not spoken about. And so I think we have still a ways to go as a society to really make a dent in this.